Nikolai Morozov was an honored academic, a well-known revolutioneer and one of the key members of the famous group of radical revolutionaries titled, The Will of the People. A love for science, mysticism and a memory of a religious worldview he had as a kid came together seamlessly in his personality. For 25 years he served his supposedly lifetime prison term in the Schlüsselburg fortress of St. Petersburg until he was liberated over an amnesty of 1905. Leaving the prison, he carried out 26 volumes of manuscripts, about 15,000 pages, containing about 200 monographs in mathematics, chemistry, physics, and history, which he began to publish in freedom. The matter of this text is a certain study, and it is an amazing one. An original title of the study was wordy and not very interesting, The History of the Mankind in the Light of the Natural Science, but in print it was changed to provocative, The Christ, for the sake of better sales. At some point publication was halted, but 7 volumes published during its author's life still make it over 5,000 pages long. Another 5 volumes were published soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In his study, Morozov outlined his extensive theory that was totally redefining the traditional view of the ancient history of the mankind. The main thesis of Morozov was pretty bold. An entirety of our knowledge about the ancient world is unreliable and appear to be a fantastic reflection of some unrelated events of the Middle Ages. The ancient times of Greece, Rome, Persia, India and China, the 12 wonders of the world, even Tamerlane, never actually existed. In support of this idea, Morozov pointed out a number of striking parallelisms of ancient history and medieval history. Let us discuss the basic claims that Morozov makes in his study. M. Postnikov, Doctor of Physics and Mathematics, Professor, Lenin Prize Laureate. Anyone can check any verities of mathematics, physics, or geography, but historical claims do not allow for direct experimental research. We cannot go back in time and check the validity of given information. We cannot escape the second-hand nature of any historical information, so we have to rely on written evidence mostly, but its accuracy have to be assessed. Of course, a historical document can only possess a certain value as long as it is authentic, i.e. does not appear to be a falsification made by frivolous or unscrupulous descendants. Fortunately, an authenticity of the majority of documents is self-evident for the majority of historical studies. This authenticity relies on their continuity and their bulk character. For example, we are quite confident that in the second half of the 18th century Catherine II was the Empress of Russia, and a civil unrest led by Yermilian Pugachov occurred in Catherine's reign, and then the country was inherited by Paul I, etc. etc. A colossal amount of documents of that time whose authenticity is justified with cross-links, creating a continuous chain extending all the way up to our days, make these statements just as reliable as the statement about the round shape of the earth. However, a certain detail like who Paul's father was are beyond us already, and doubts arose even about the matter of Paul being a son of Catherine. There was also a debate whether Alexander I died in 1825, so-called the problem of the old man Kuzimik. It is clear that the deeper we delve into the past, the more radical a matter of an authenticity is. The case of the antique documents is especially poor. A chain of consecutive copies that would go since the Antiquity till a moment of stamping on a printing press doesn't exist for any of these works. Moreover, we typically get the most recent copies only, not older than 9th to 10th centuries, whose background is absolutely unknown. For example, around 1425 an unknown monk carried the manuscript of Tacitus from some North German monastery to its discoverer Poggio. Poggio never told anyone neither a name of the monk nor a location of the monastery. The rhetorical writings of Cicero were known in excerpts only until in 1420, when a Milanese professor Barzitzer, a specialist on Cicero, found its complete text in Lodi. After copying, the manuscript of Lodi disappeared. Sick. The Greek classics are similar case. Plato was basically unknown to humanists until 1482, when Ficino published a Latin translation of his dialogues. However, despite the numerous demands of his friends and his publishers, Ficino never showed anyone his Greek originals, and after his death they disappeared without a trace. The circumstance of discovery of an ancient texts remain unknown even till this day. For example, details of 1891 discovery of an Aristotle's, the Athenian polity, were once hidden and still remain a mystery. Topic: could an ancient book even reach us? All the museum and library staff is well aware that without special precautions books and manuscripts deteriorate quickly and become completely useless. Books should be kept at certain temperature. They should be protected from dust, protected from damp and direct sunlight, protected from mold, insects, rodents, and dozens of other protective means, too, should be undertaken. And yet a lifespan of a book is just a few centuries. Therefore, to be preserved for centuries, books should be rewritten regularly. No historian doubt an existence of the continuous handwritten tradition that goes back to one of its ancient editions ultimately, for each ancient composition. This is the most primitive syllogism in effect. 1. The antique book has reached our days. 2. Without rewriting this is impossible. 3. Therefore, the books were rewritten. But whom was this rewriting carried out by? A typical answer is how it was done in monasteries by pious monks, working selflessly, for the salvation of the soul. And this is the only answer possible indeed, because in a course of centuries this work could be performed by a permanent and powerful organization only. But at this moment one gets a few doubts immediately. First point, in the early Middle Ages, from the 6th to the 9th century, illiteracy among monasticism was almost universal. Literate people weren't just not respected at all, but they were looked at with fear and considered sorcerers touched by magic and evil spirit. Official clerical authorities could only put up with literacy just like they did with any inevitable and necessary evil. So even if there really were attempts of an individual enthusiasts to rewrite non-clerical books in these conditions, they could merely be tolerated and definitely not encouraged. But we, too, must remember that because of a high cost of parchment, rewriting of books, too, required considerable financial expense at that time. How supposed enthusiasts kept finding their necessary funds. And not just once or twice but in a course of many centuries. However, the history does know one such enthusiast, the famous Cassiodorus, who lived in the 6th century, allegedly. But an actual information about Cassiodorus is rather scarce, and there is a high probability that this is just a fictional person. However, even if we approve the legend of Cassiodorus, it would remain unclear anyway who funded book rewriting for another 400 years, i.e. since his death till 9th and 10th centuries, when finally people's attitude toward literacy changed and rewriting of books in monasteries became ideologically and financially possible. Second point. Because of an external pressure of official authorities and according to their inner beliefs, monks copyists had to focus their attention on books of divine content. Monks are very, very bad candidates for status of collectors of texts with paganism and free thinking. But then, one has to ask, who rewrote, not once and not twice, an atheistic poem by Lucretius Carus, titled as, On a Nature of Things? Historians claim that the note, wait what? Of Cicero dated March 15, 44 BC, was preserved and possibly related to the murder of Caesar. Congratulations, I am glad for you. I want to know what are you doing and what is happening. Isn't it strange that pious monks were copying this note faithfully for centuries? Third point. Rewriting of a scientific, for example, mathematical essays, require one to at least understand their value and think of a single possible reader. But who could possibly understand and appreciate Euclid, Archimedes and Apollonia in the 8th and the 10th centuries? Arabs could? Okay, but who was rewriting Euclid prior to the Arabs? By the way, the oldest known manuscript of Euclid's, The Beginnings, usually considered to be made in 888 in Byzantium for the Bishop of Caesarea. Does it mean that top-class mathematicians existed in the 9th century Byzantium, like the aforementioned Bishop of Caesarea, who could understand Euclid and were interested in him? Fourth thing. Classical Latin was unknown for medieval monks. Is it possible to imagine a monk who does not know a language but nevertheless he is rewriting Cicero meticulously like a machine? All these considerations compel us to reject the previously mentioned syllogism and compose a new one. 1. Without rewriting an ancient book could never reach us. 2. There was no one to perform rewriting, and therefore there was no rewriting. 3. Consequently, an ancient book could not reach us. Topic. It won't do without paper. But could an ancient book even exist? To prepare a single sheet of parchment, a calf skin, very expensive thing on its own, must be subjected to long, complex and expensive processing. This rose a parchment to a status of a jewel, and this situation persisted until an invention of the rag paper on an eve of the Renaissance, and this is not an accidental coincidence. How could graceful literature develop in circumstance of such value and rarity of writing material? Person who want to write a branching literary essay with a complex structure need rather high culture. This kind of culture is taught with an examples and also with personal attempts of person himself, but all of it require a sufficient amount of available writing material anyway. Moreover, one is required to be literate, of course. That is, to know and to be able to be guided by generally accepted provisions of spelling and grammar. However, constant and perennial exercises, prescriptions, dictations, etc., are required to become illiterate, but these are not possible on parchment, and we'd like to add, on papyrus too, that was not much cheaper. To achieve sufficient literacy and an ability to effortlessly express your thoughts in writing, not only one have to write a countless number of dictations, but he also have to read a great number of books written in standard spelling. A person who does not read a lot of books will remain illiterate no matter how conscientiously he's studying, and anyway he won't ever be a writer using his language with confidence. An illiterate author would write out each letter painfully slow, would guess how to write almost every letter, so in one sitting he would write a very short text only. Cramped with a lack of writing material, he would never possibly coordinate these texts with each other in any satisfying way by rewriting them several times. Having several different stories collected, or having them compiled independently, he could only rewrite them one after another almost intact except connecting them with simple transitional bridges, suddenly, then, etc. And in fact, genuine ancient writings, the Bible, the Indian epic, the medieval romance of chivalry, possess this exact kind of structure. It was actually as late as the 19th century when writers learned to combine individual episodes of their novels in a more skillful manner. All this proves that more or less developed literature of any kind is impossible without paper. Therefore, in particular, literary works characterized with fairly correct spelling, complex syntax and elegant style, ones currently called antique, were most likely written in an era when a paper was widespread already, an era of their discovery. Topic: Was there Herodotus? It is known that anonymity was a characteristic feature of medieval literary production. Its authors did not consider it necessary to put their name on it. When an early humanists led by Petrarch went on an expedition for rat-gnawed parchments, then, not satisfied with an anonymity of found manuscripts, they began to attribute them to any famous ancient names they saw fit. By the way, these names were associated with quite different professions at those times. For example, Virgil was considered a magician, Plato was a doctor, Archimedes was an astrologer, and Cicero was a troubadour. A medieval habit to attribute one's works to famous ancient names also contributed here. For example, a bunch of medieval theological writings were attributed to John Chrysostom by their authors, and even Petrarch himself liked to write letters, biographies, etc., on behalf of the ancients. As these works fell into the hands of the collectors 100 years later, they automatically turned out to be ancient. With the development of the humanistic movement and a growing demand for ancient manuscripts, their malicious fraud has emerged. Scientists of the 15th and the 16th centuries mention shameless falsifiers in their letters constantly and say how they are trying to foist their pitiful crafts. However, humanists themselves, too, are indulged in falsification. German humanist Prolusius wrote the 7th book of Ovid's calendar mythology to win an academic debate. Higa, Spanish monk, invented the Roman historian Dexter and wrote an extensive essay on his behalf in order to fill an unfortunate gap in the history of spread of the Christianity in Spain. Famous humanist Sigonius composed and published a number of new passages of Cicero. Annius de Viterbi published a collection of fake works by a number of Roman authors that he has composed himself. These are established facts. When a forger does not confess on his own, it is very difficult to expose a skillfully made fake, and this typically happens by a pure accident. For example, an academic world was convinced in an authenticity of a forgery of Sigonius for 200 years until a letter was found in which Sigonius himself confessed of his falsification. Therefore, there is no doubt that a number of malicious fraud has not been exposed yet. For example, in the 19th century, a Frenchman Polydore Hochart and an Englishman John Wilson Ross demonstrated in great detail and argumentation that the writings of Tacitus are skillful falsifications made by Poggio Bracciolini, who was desperate for money at the very moment of his discovery of Tacitus. Hochart and Ross revealed a large number of passages in a text of Tacitus in particular in which an author reveals his unfamiliarity with the geography of Rome, with a Roman character, military affairs, etc., as well as passages that expose him as a person with a worldview and traditions of 15th century. In case of less authoritative author, this would already be enough to prove a falsification, but nevertheless anything is forgiven for Tacitus. In a similar fashion, a text of Herodotus is literally teeming with mistakes, and many of them expose a medieval origin of the text. But instead of recognizing its falsity, historians shield Herodotus in every way. His mistakes, as big as, for example, 1,500 years, in his presentation of Egyptian history, are explained with his non-critical treatment of his own informants. There were Egyptian priests among them, so they were obliged to know the history of their own country, and a medieval character of his mistakes is explained with an argument that scientists of the Middle Ages borrowed them from Herodotus and not vice versa. In this case, respect for an authority obviously wins over common sense. The example of Poggio the Tacitus makes us think that we are dealing with a malicious falsification whenever a circumstance of the discovery of manuscripts are deliberately vague and unverifiable. Therefore, we are almost sure Dialogues of Plato were falsified. By the way, to this day experts can't even come to an agreement on their authenticity, as well as Cicero's rhetorical works were. An essay by Vitruvius, titled, On Architecture, in which a heliocentric, periods of planetary orbits are shown with minute accuracy unknown even to Copernicus, yells of its falsification. Apparently we are dealing not with malicious but with forced falsification here. A young scientist, was it Alberti, desperate to publish a book with his name on it, was made, either on his own initiative or under a pressure of his publisher, to publish it signed with an ancient pseudonym to ensure the greatest demand. One of an important reasons for a falsification was also a desire of an author of writings with free-thinking or anti-clerical character, Lucretius Arius, to hide behind an ancient name, as if behind a shield. Depriving himself of dangerous glory, an author could at least be ensured of a wide dissemination of his views. There are hoaxes of different kind. For example, we know Celsus, an extremely anti-Christian writer of the 2nd century. His writings have not reached us and his views are only known from writings of Origen who was refuting him. It is noteworthy that Origen is citing Celsus in detail and present his views carefully, but essentially does not refute them in any way and just limit himself with crude abuse and statements like, "This is impossible because it contradicts the Holy Scripture." What if this, Origen, is just a mask of an anti-clerical author who decided to present his views in this form? This, Origen's, citation of Celsus is so detailed that modern researchers were able to restore almost an entire work of Celsus's based on Origen's quotations. Besides, what if Tertullian's famous phrase, "I believe it because it is absurd," is actually a subtle mockery by an anti-clerical apocryphist author? One of the latest documented camouflage falsifications is an essay, On the System of the World, by Aristarch from Samos, published in 1644 and written by the famous Roberval who used an ancient pseudonym, perhaps one he created himself, to propagate an ideas of Copernicus but at the same time avoid an inquisitorial persecution that Galileo had just been subjected to for the same thing. However, when he was in France, Roberval was not hiding his authorship very much, so these days we know the truth. But what if Roberval kept his incognito more carefully? Wouldn't we have one more, miraculously extant, antique work now, available in a print only, with a hopelessly lost original? Topic: Euclid and Ptolemy. In regards to scientific, and, in particular, mathematical, ancient writings, an assertion of their falsification in the Middle Ages comes up against a question of their true author. Unlike humanitarian works where one can either point out an intended author directly or at least outline a circle of people who are quite capable of being educated, cultured, and literary, but one wonder, who could have written the Basics by Euclid? Of course, a mathematician of this magnitude could not disappear in a centuries without a trace anyway. But nevertheless, in the Middle Ages we cannot specify anyone at least a little bit suitable for role of an author of the Basics. To explain this, one should take into account that prior to an invention of printing, each scientist was copying books of his predecessors for personal usage only, and therefore he was correcting obscure places during this rewriting, and he was also making additions that were necessary in his opinion. Therefore, the text of a book was being modified constantly, with each new rewriting, replenished with new material and increasing in volume. A process of unconscious collective creativity was taking place. Naturally, a composition was left with the name of an original author. A scientist would sign his copy as the Euclid's geometry and not mention that he added 2 or 3 his own theorems and substantiated one or another of an old one's a bit better. Thus, He was providing a reason for subsequent copyists to also add 2 or 3 theorems from themselves but keep a former name of a textbook. Something similar happens with textbooks to this day, being replenished with fresh material constantly. They typically keep a name of an original author. This way a collection of a dozen most simple theorems over the centuries turned into a big book, well developed in its details. The historians of science, having overlooked this century-long process of improvement, attributed this book to a single ancient giant of geometrical science and overestimated a level of knowledge in ancient times. Of course this is applicable not only to Euclid, by the way his name allows for a meaningful translation, well interwoven, but also Aristotle, whose name translates in even more remarkable way, the best conclusion, and Ptolemy. His name means fighting the god. Publications of all these authors were preceded with so-called bad translations that clearly represent their original, still imperfect versions. In regards to Ptolemy's book, you can also list over a dozen astronomical evidence confirming its attribution to 16th century, when it was first published. For example, it is known how longitudes of all the stars increase by 50.2 seconds per year as a result of precession. Division of a difference between modern longitudes and longitudes given by Ptolemy in his The Catalogue of Stars, by 50.2, gives us the time of an observation of this catalogue. The corresponding calculation gives a 16th century exactly. In addition, in a 2nd century when this astronomer lived supposedly, a star closest to the pole was not a modern polar star, Alpha Ursa Minor, but a brighter star of the same constellation, Beta, and a star called Achernar was completely unavailable for an observation. But Ptolemy begins his catalogue with the polar star, and ends it with Achernar nevertheless. Topic: Exclusivity of the ancient society. Medieval origins of the ancient works are also evident in an improbability and fantastic nature of an information they contain about political, social and economic structure of an ancient society. This fantasticality is well known basically but interpreted as exclusivity traditionally. The flourishing of science and culture in the ancient Greece is also exceptional. It is not justified with the development of productive forces and production relations in any way, and which is already quite strange. It also affected neither an equipment nor socio-political structure. No way around the notorious spirit of Hellenism. This uniqueness fantasticality not just extend to global structures, but also permeate every element of a traditional concept of the ancient society. Particularly fantastic are the messages of the classics on the matter of military affairs. That is not surprising though given the desk nature of a scholarship of their true authors. Regardless of an elementary requirements of strategy, they choose such an uncomfortable points for their victories and such conditions in which one can perish only. They lead armies through countries where everyone would starve to death in a week. And on the battlefield they force kings and generals to ride pairs of horses in an one-sided single pole that is prone to turn over in the first sharp turn, and even more so, on a field laid with corpses. They force Roman soldiers to build a fortified camp every night after a tiring march by performing an excavational work on a scale accessible to excavators only, etc. etc. Thus, all these considerations lead to the same conclusion. An entirety of the so-called, the antique literature, was written in the Middle Ages, and the ancient history of Greece and Rome, prior to the 4th century AD at least, was the greatest mystification done by medieval writers and historians. Can this idea be proven with methods of mathematics or natural science? Topic: The ideas of Morozov. Back in the 16th century, an idea was expressed that for each document with a description of an astronomical phenomenon that can be dated with a calculation, a solar or a moon eclipse for example, it is possible to determine an authenticity of such historical document. But chronologists were using this method in a one-sided manner. Not doubting an authenticity of a certain document, they were combining astronomical calculations with an entire complex of historical information. Morozov, on the other hand, offered a method of unbiased astronomical dating. According to this method, characteristics of an eclipse are extracted from a text, and dates of all the eclipse with these characteristics are being written out from astronomical tables. For example, look at a solar eclipse described by Thucydides in his book, The History of the Peloponnesian War, occurring at the beginning of the war. It turns out that in a course of the last 3,000 years there was just a single eclipse in the Mediterranean that really matched the description of Thucydides, and that is an eclipse of August 2nd, 1133 AD. Thus, in full compliance with everything stated above, the Book of Thucydides turns out to be a medieval composition written not earlier than the 12th century. Since Thucydides is mentioned by Herodotus, this also proves the medieval origin of the history by Herodotus. But of course a sole dating of the work of Thucydides can be disputed with an argument of it being special. To get more meaningful results, one had to study all the eclipses mentioned in ancient documents. They contain 89 eclipse descriptions, but 10 of them are absolutely unsatisfactory. Sometimes it is not even clear if the matter is really an eclipse, or is it, say, some meteorological phenomenon, and therefore 79 eclipses were analyzed. The results are the following. Prior to a middle of the 4th century, not a single eclipse is confirmed by the astronomy and 75% are rejected altogether. On the contrary, past a middle of the 4th century, 2 eclipses only, 8%, are rejected by the astronomy. This not only confirms the general thesis about a medieval origin of the ancient literature, but also makes it possible to concretize it. It turns out, any works traditionally attributed into times prior to a middle of the 4th century AD were written much later. Therefore it is necessary to consider any information about events that took place in the Mediterranean prior to the 4th century AD to be mythical. One of the most amazing, and at the same time the most fundamental observations of Morozov was a discovery of parallel pairs among ancient dynasties. Take a look at the Roman Empire from this point of view. As you know, the Roman Empire was created by Sulla and Pompeius, but it basically collapsed after Caracalla in the 3rd century AD, so called the crisis of the 3rd century. We call this period the Roman Empire II. Say the name of the Roman Empire I for a legendary period of the 7 Roman kings from Romulus to Tarquin. The empire was restored by Aurelian and Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century AD and existed till the end of the 5th century. We call this period the Roman Empire III. But if we would compile a successive list of emperors for Empire II and Empire III and compare them, duration of their reign will be pretty similar for all 27 positions. In addition to numerical parallelism, Morozov also pointed out a certain parallelism of events. Thus, both lists begin with major political figures possessing similar honorary titles and end with eminent emperors who are known for their identical initiative to bestow the right of the Roman citizenship on an entire free population of the empire. The only rational explanation for these coincidences is a history of the Empire II being written off from a history of the Empire III. The Empire III was the only one to exist independently, and the Empire II was just its phantom shadow that appeared as a result of conscientious delusions and malicious frauds of later times. However, one shall not think as if at least we can trust in information about the Empire III. Quite the contrary, a careful analysis of this information Unfortunately, size of this article does not allow us to do this, shows that apparently an information about Empire 3 is just as false as an information about the Empire 2. If there is something to talk about with some confidence, it is only the very fact of Empire 3's existence. But an entirety of its state structure, social relations and religious life are fantasies of much later times. This empire should be imagined according to a model of the ancient Russian state, as a conglomerate of coastal city-states, basically independent, but recognizing a formal authority of an emperor and paying him an annual tribute. In various regions of this motley empire, chroniclers were compiling their lists of current events. These records were written in local languages, reflected mostly local events and referred to their emperors by their local nicknames. A few centuries later, because of a growing influence of the papal Rome, it becomes necessary to back up his claims on world domination in religious and secular life with some references to power it allegedly possessed in the past. And then begin all the attempts to create its history on the basis of these annals. During this process, chronicles describing the same reigns but originating from different places and written in different languages were mistaken for descriptions of different reigns, so they were arranged sequentially. Topic: how could this happen? Morozov explained this mechanism with an example of the 19th century Austrian Empire. This empire was a two-parter. German Austria with the capital of Vienna and Magyar Hungary with the capital of Budapest. Slavic Bosnia-Herzegovina, too, joined this pair later. Franz Joseph reigned in this empire since 1848. He lived in his Viennese palace almost constantly and visited Budapest just occasionally. Austrian Germans considered him their king. Hungarian Magyars considered him their king, and finally annexed Herzegovins considered him their prince. His troops consisted of German, Magyar, and Slavic regiments. Each of these three parts lived its own inner life, had its own economical and civil evolution. Foreign trade and other economic relations were conducted separately for each part, depending on geographic location. So only a representation before foreign powers was common and wars were also fought together. Imagine that some Hungarian chronicler wrote the history of Hungary in Hungarian and he called Franz Joseph just Joseph, and some German chronicler in Tyrol wrote the history of Austria, i.e. Tyrol with Vienna, in German and he called Franz Joseph just Franz, and just like the first chronicler he was just counting time in years of his reign. Imagine that some Bosnian monk did the same in Slavonic, calling him in his own manner, Francis. Imagine that our modern literature on an event of the 19th century have perished in some kind of public or elemental cataclysm and just these three manuscripts survived miraculously. Then a culture began anew from its infancy and a certain historian found these documents in about 300 years. If he was eager to learn as much as possible about the history of the lost culture, he would unwittingly succumb to a desire to accept Francis and Joseph for three sovereigns, one of whom reigned over Tyrol, another reigned over Hungary, and the third one reigned over Bosnia-Herzegovina. He would note that each of them was related with other two countries. The big difference in a culture of each described country would easily give him an idea that he is dealing with three periods of culture of the same Danube Empire that was called Austria as a whole, and he would write a scientific treatise called Three Periods of the Austrian Culture. First, Austria under the Slavic sovereignty of Francis I. Second, Austria under the Magyar sovereignty of Joseph I. Third, Austria under the German sovereignty of Franz I. He would be confused easily, too, with city titles mentioned by three chroniclers. For example, Hungarian capital of Budapest is a two-parter and consists of Pest on the right bank of the Danube and Buda on the left bank, and Buda is also called Ofen in German. In records of German chronicler, Budapest would be called Berghofen, in records of Hungarian chronicler it would just be called Buda, and in records of Slavic chronicler it would be called the town of Pest. Upon restoring one town in its real place, historian would look for other towns elsewhere. He would create 3 conquests out of the same conquest of Budapest after the Hungarian uprising, the seizure of the town of Pest by Francis I, prior to him becoming the Bosnian sovereign, the seizure of Buda by Joseph I during the Hungarian dynasty, and finally the capture of Ofen by Franz I during the German dynasty. Referring to Hungary etymologically and geographically, he would search, and with a strong desire, he would find Ofen somewhere in German countries. For example, he would mistake the town of Guff in Bavaria for Ofen. Exactly the same thing would happen with the rest of geographical names and with Vienna itself, that is called Veden in Slavonic and Van in German. As a result of this interconnection of 3 histories of different languages and different stories, the reign of the same Franz Joseph would turn out to be the story of 3 different kings in 3 different countries, and their reigns would not have anything in common besides a consonance of some names, for example Franz and Francis, Van and Vienna. The concept of the Roman Empire too, that in fact never really existed, was created in the same way. And since the empire too is a myth, we also have to inevitably deny a real existence of the antique ancient Greece, as well as reject an idea of a terrible catastrophe of the 5th century when an invasion of barbarians allegedly destroyed the ancient civilization and humanity had to begin its cultural development from scratch. Cultural development of mankind never actually experienced global catastrophes, and an idea of it should be considered the same rudiment of 18th century metaphysics like a paleontological, the catastrophe theory, by George Cuvier. Moreover, the Middle Ages were absolutely not a dark period, they were not a dark centuries of material and spiritual domination, of obscurantism, monastic fanaticism, centuries of human darkness, theological and scholastic wisdom. On the contrary, these were times of intensive scientific development, times of living thought and vigorous activity that took place, just like in the new time, in a constant and bitter struggle against an obscurantism of the clerical ideology. Just a weak echoes of this titanic activity, which fell into the Antiquity, almost completely managed to reach us.